Hello, and welcome to Conversations with Matt DeLockery. This is the final episode for Chapter 2 of Colossians, and today we're going to be covering the rest of Paul's critique of the philosophy. Verses 20 to 23 say, "If with Christ you died to the elemental forces of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch," referring to things that all perish as they are used, according to human precepts and teachings. These indeed have an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. Paul continues his argument against the alternate philosophy of Colossae by reminding the Colossians that they have died with Christ. Think back to everything we talked about in verses 11 to 15 of this chapter. Remember the 5 metaphors that describe our relationship with Christ? Paul is pointing back to this and reminding the Colossians that they died with Christ. Here he is taking that point further and explaining that they have died to the world. Here you start to see how theology impacts life. To a lot of us, theology can seem like this thing that you read about in dusty old books and that may have historical value but doesn't really affect our lives today. But here you can see one of the ways that Paul bridges theology and life. Because you have died with Christ, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? The logic is pretty straightforward. When you die physically, you're no longer on this earth, right? Well, if you're no longer on this earth, then the things of this world don't apply to you, do they? Here, because of a theological belief, Paul is giving them a concrete reason for why they should respond a certain way to the very real situation in front of them. Now, Paul's argument a few verses ago, back in 11 to 15, was that Christians have died spiritually with Christ. On Paul's view, that means that like the person who has physically died, we are no longer subject to the things of this world. Obviously, though, we still have to eat and sleep and breathe, and we will still physically die one day. We're still physically here. That's completely true, but Paul is not saying that we are no longer bound to the physical requirements of this world. It's not like we can start ignoring the law of gravity, for example, even though that would be really cool. Rather, Paul is saying that we have died spiritually, and therefore we are no longer subject to some of the same spiritual things we once were. There are 2 different deaths that Christians will have to go through. There's a spiritual death with Christ, which comes first, and there is a physical death, which comes second. The spiritual death with Christ happens at the point a person follows Christ. Physical death will come later. The point I want to make here is that there's both a spiritual death and a physical death, and each of these will separate us from something that controls us, whether rules, laws, or some sort of ruler. As a result of dying spiritually with Christ, we are no longer subject to some of the same things we once were. We are no longer a part of the domain of darkness, so we are no longer bound to the rules and rulers of that kingdom. The rulers of that kingdom may fight against us, but the effects they have on us are limited. We serve a different king and are a part of a different kingdom. I understand this is a little confusing. Let's take a look at what Paul called the elemental forces of the world, and I think that will help make things make a little more sense. We first looked at what these elemental forces of the world might be when we looked at 2:8. Perhaps the simplest way to explain what they are to modern ears is to call these elemental forces the power of the world, or the powers that be. Some of these might be powerful people like our bosses or those in government that change our world. Some of these might be forces of the economy. Some of these might be sickness and death, or birth and new life, and any number of other things that you can think of. Take all of these and put them together, and you'll get a rough idea of what Paul is referring to as the elemental forces of this world. However, in the ancient mind, the physical world and the spiritual world were not separate. The two were connected, and passages like the one about spiritual warfare in Ephesians 6:10-17, especially verse 12, indicate that Christians thought of the two worlds as connected as well. So behind all the powers of this world were, and are, spiritual forces that affect our world to some degree. The evil ones work against Christians, but they cannot control us. Okay, let's do a brief recap because we're about to start answering another, though related, question and I want to make sure that you have this first. There is a physical world and there is a spiritual world, and these are connected. There are forces in each world that we are subject to. Death frees us from these forces. When we physically die, we will no longer be subject to physical laws and forces like we are now. For those of us who spiritually die with Christ, we become free from the spiritual forces that we are subject to now. That means that we are freed from the domain of darkness, and so, while its rulers can cause us temporary harm, they have no lasting hold on us anymore. Make sense? Now, one thing we do know about the philosophy is that those who followed it were trying to escape the control of such forces. In this, they were actually on the same page as Christianity. The philosophers wanted to be able to live free from the control of these forces, and Paul wanted the same thing for the Colossians and all Christians as well. Again, when Paul talks about being free from these forces, that doesn't mean that these forces will no longer exist or impact your life. What he means is that they will no longer control your life. Impact, yes. Control, no. Now, while both Paul and the philosophers wanted to free others from the control of these forces, they went about it in very different ways. The philosophers were trying to escape the control of these forces via asceticism. Asceticism is basically a religious form of self-discipline in which you try to become more spiritual by restricting yourself from essential things, food, water, pleasure, etc. Notice the commands of the philosophy that Paul is referencing in verse 21. Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. The philosophers were trying to escape the control of this world by learning not to be dependent on the things of this world. And that method does seem to make some sense, right? If you want to not be controlled by the things of this world, then learn to deal without them. That was one of the philosophy's basic teachings, and we can see why the Colossians might be persuaded by it. Now, the severity to the body mentioned in verse 23, which probably included inflicting pain on oneself, doesn't sound so fun. But if we include it in this same category of learning not to be controlled by the things of this world, it can still make sense. Don't be controlled by pain, so get used to it. It doesn't sound like something I think most of us would sign up for, but it still makes logical sense. However, Paul's argument is that while these ideas may make some logical sense, they don't actually work. The ascetic practices that the philosophers recommended were meant to toughen a person up and make them more able to handle whatever the world had to throw at them. Ultimately, though, that's all that would happen. If you followed their advice and succeeded, you'd develop a stiff upper lip and be better able to handle all the difficult things we encounter in life. But the only thing that would really change would be your attitude. No real change would take place. What Paul is saying is that if you follow Christ, your future reality would be different. Because things would actually be different in the future, everything in this life becomes something temporary that will pass away in the not-too-distant future. This is how Paul could look at his imprisonment as a positive thing. Sure, it was unpleasant, but it served a purpose and would be over soon. He got to contribute to something good, and the pain and suffering that he underwent weren't going to last that long. He had something good to look forward to, the glory with Christ that he would one day experience, which we'll talk about at the beginning of chapter 3. So the choice on the table for the Colossians, and really for all of humanity, is to either 1. Learn how to grit your teeth in the face of terrible things, all the while being promised a spiritual experience that will never work out, because man cannot simply reach up to God. Or 2. Have something really change about your future so that you will actually get to God, because you're following the path God made, and while you'll still have to deal with unpleasant things during your life here, it won't be forever. The short of it is that if you choose the way of Christ, you don't have to merely grit your teeth because this is all that there is, and you just have to learn how to deal with it. Following Christ is how it is possible to have joy in the midst of suffering. You know there's a bigger purpose and that it won't last forever. There's a much better reality that all those who follow Christ will be a part of, and what we're experiencing now is just temporary. It will pass. That's why Paul says asceticism and severity to the body are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. After all, if this life is all that there is, why would you stop yourself from enjoying things that feel good and are pleasant? If there is no real spiritual experience to be had, why would you deprive yourself to get, well, nothing? Stopping the indulgence of the flesh is not easy. It's super difficult. But if we're actually out from under the control of these forces of darkness, it becomes easier. And if we realize that the things of this world are going to pass away, and we have joined Christ's team and will be a part of the good things to come, it becomes easier still. It helps to remember that we are only here for a little while and that glory with Christ is coming. That is why it's possible to have joy in the midst of suffering, and that is why following Christ makes it easier to stop the indulgence of the flesh. The path to God made by God is better than the path to God made by humans. And that is essentially Paul's argument against the philosophy of Colossae and why he thinks that Christianity is better than any other worldview. Put very simply, the path to God made by God is better than the path to God made by humans. This is what we've been looking at this whole chapter. Essentially, this statement explained in long form. In Christ, Christians receive entrance into the new people of God, forgiveness from moral transgressions as part of this new relationship, and freedom from the powers that stand against us. Other worldviews promise much, but can deliver little. It all comes down to what we talked about in chapter 1, who Christ is and what he has done. And, is any of that true? If Christ is who Paul and Christianity say he is, then every other worldview is inferior and ineffective. They're just man's attempts to reach up to God. But if Christianity is not true, then everything we've been talking about is just a delusion, a fairy tale we tell ourselves to feel better. In that case, we should abandon it and look for what really is true. Everything hinges on the question, is this true? Because if it is, then as we have discussed, there is an unbroken chain from the truth of who Christ is, to what he has done, to what he commands, to how we should live. It is worth taking our time to investigate and answer that question, because the answer will determine what path we should follow. Because if what Paul has been telling us about Christ is true, then it is the only path.